Alright folks, today we're benchmarking Dota 2. We're using an RTX 3080, it's the Trinity OC version at stock. We're using a Ryzen 950x at stock for the processor. Now our RAM is 32GB of CL16 3600. This hopefully will eliminate any bottlenecks if you're using a 3080. And if you are using a 3080, you can see maybe what sort of difference you'd get if you leveled up your processor to basically the top end. Now the footage you're seeing in the background is from an esports replay, and I selected 5 minutes that I think represent sort of regular Dota 2 gameplay. Some farming, some team fights, a bit of Roche play, that type of stuff, so hopefully that will represent properly what kind of experience you're going to get in game. Now interestingly, before we get into the actual benchmark video, at a certain point in time I just took a snapshot of a big explosion. It was 109 FPS at 1080p. This is max settings. It was 106 at 1440p. Again, taken as this big rupture came down, it was 106 frames at 1440p. And at 4K, it was 104 FPS. So pretty much the lows were very, very similar. And when running at the lowest settings, so this is 1080p on the lowest, again, the lows were very similar, 126 FPS and 124 FPS. So there's definitely some stuff going on here with Dota 2 to do with like utilization and just generally what type of game it is. I'll try chat through, and once you've maybe got bored of me, you can just skip to the next section. So we've got 3 sections: 1080p low, high, 1440p low, high, and 4K. Now at 1080p, you're basically, you're never realistically going below 130. But what's, I guess, quote, strange but not strange is basically the reason the game has such kind of similar frame rates depending on what you play is at 1080p it's just bottlenecked. It's, if you look at the green bar, the graphics card has just not been utilized at all. Turning up the settings a little bit does give it some juice, and it does let it, produce that bit more performance, but you're not really losing much. If you were playing at 4K maxed and you went to low, you'd gain a huge amount of frames in a different game. With Dota 2, if you play max 1080p on a card like this and you play low, you're not really gaining that many more frames because it's just not been utilized. So put it this way, if I was to recommend a setting you're going to play Dota 2 out with a setup like this, it's going to be 1440p maxed or 4K maxed or 4K kind of high, that kind of thing. So we'll jump into 1440p now. You can watch the rest of this benchmark if you want, or you can just join me at the 1440p section, and that's when I'll carry on talking.
Radiant's courier has been killed. under attack. Dire's middle tower has fallen. Dire structures are fortified. Radiant structures are fortified. Dire's middle tower is under attack. Dire's middle tower has fallen. Dire's middle barracks are under attack. Dire's middle barracks has fallen. Dire's middle barracks has fallen. Dire's top tower is under attack.
So on 1440p at the lowest and the max, you can see there's not that much difference. This is because I feel like the card's beginning to be slightly more used. It's now hovering around the 50% utilization, sometimes spiking to the 70 and 80. On low, it's kind of like 30 to 60 area. It's still not perfect, obviously, but again, this is kind of, I feel like, where the 3080 is set in stone. It's a 1440p maxed out card. That's kind of what it is. 1440p maxed out, you can sit at 300 frames, and occasionally it will dip to 120, but it's never going below 100, and I feel like there's like a break point where if you're playing around 100 FPS or 120, and you go to like 80, you can kind of notice it. If you're playing at 140 and you go to 120, can't really notice it. And if you're playing at 200 FPS and you go to like 120, you can notice it, but it's just still very, very, very good and playable. So with a card like this, you're very, very safe to max out 1440p with no worries. Remember, this is everything on. You could probably turn off some filtering, turn off ultra settings if you want to give yourself that bit more juice. Maybe you're competitive and you want to be locked at sort of that 240 sort of FPS area, but the game is the game. When it hits an area that it sort of is gonna dip to, it doesn't matter if you've got a 3080 or a 2060, it's gonna dip a bit because it's just kind of how the game's made. It's not like having a 3080 is gonna suddenly stop you dipping. It's still gonna dip. Obviously there's still areas of action, but the areas of action are gonna go to, like you can see here, 110, and lowest is 120, 130. It's not that big of a difference, so absolutely playable at max settings, and obviously absolutely playable at lowest, but you're not really losing much by turning the settings up, just because at this point still the card hasn't really been utilized, and yeah. So we'll jump into 4K.
Monster kill!
under attack. Dire's middle tower has fallen. Dire's structures are fortified. Radiant structures are fortified. Dire's middle tower is under attack. Dire's middle tower has fallen. Dire's middle barracks are under attack. Dire's middle barracks has fallen. Dire's middle barracks has fallen. Dire's top tower is under attack.
"4K max and 4K lowest, this is where the card actually begins to stretch its legs for Dota 2. In other games, you know, like Cyberpunk, you put it on 1440p, it will begin to stretch its legs. Dota 2, it's still not really sweating it. Now when you go to 4K, you will see some areas where it actually spikes to 97% usage, and even on the lowest settings, it's now 60 to 80 kind of region. So definitely the card likes resolution in a game like this. It's not really too bothered about the settings. Once again, there is a more of a difference in frame rate here because now the card's beginning to be utilized, but if you play 4K maxed and you're currently at 240 FPS and 4K lowest is 370, you kind of have a decision. Do you want to play 4K lowest and then go to 1440p maxed? Because 1440p maxed looks better than 4K lowest, but kind of weirdly, but not weirdly, some of the highest, most consistent frame rates is coming from 4K low, because the card has been pushed to that utilization point, but it's now not max, so it has some free room to keep that high frame rate. So kind of weirdly, you can interpret this maybe differently. You're looking at the figures, I'm no expert, but it almost feels like if you want a high refresh rate Dota, a 3080 with 4K lowest might even be better than 1080p lowest, and probably better than 1440p lowest. It's one of those where you've probably got to test it yourself and mix and match the settings. But you can see here, 4K lowest, it only dipped to about 130 on that explosion, whereas previous it was kind of going to like 110, 19, 130 on 1080p lowest. So I feel like because 4K is making the card actually be utilized, but you're not using that utilization on all the graphics, you're actually getting a higher base frame rate. So there's probably a happy medium where you can do 4K medium-ish, and you're going to have a really good time at your 165, 144 refresh rate. So this card, yeah, absolutely smokes Dota, kind of as expected, and so it should do. But it's, you know, it's out there now. That's the benchmark. If you're interested, there it is. I thought I'd do it for you because I am actually looking kind of to get back into Dota a little bit with some friends, so I figured I'd try it. But yeah, 4K lowest seems to be like kind of a sweet spot for Dota 2 in this card. So there we have it. Some interesting numbers, and that's kind of what happens when you play these free-to-play, highly optimized games, that you can kind of get some weird scenarios. So if you've enjoyed the content, consider supporting with the links in the description. Consider hitting that join button. If you're a YouTube Premium member, you actually get a 1 month free anyway, so sign up for YouTube Premium for your 1 month free, and then you can use it on someone like myself who's a small channel. Or if you want to do the easy route, a like and a comment helps the algorithm lords, and a subscription as well. I've also got links in the description to like Discord, Twitter, so if you want me to benchmark a game that I've got, just ping me and say, hey, can you do this, and I'll try to get round to it. Alright, thanks very much.
under attack. Dire's middle tower has fallen. Dire structures are fortified. Radiant structures are fortified. Dire's middle tower is under attack. Dire's middle tower has fallen. Dire's middle barracks are under attack. Dire's middle barracks has fallen. Dire's middle barracks